The lethal glow, the true story of the Goiânia radiation accident. Carlos wasn't just another young man searching for scraps in the alleys of Goiânia. He was a dreamer, a boy with a story of his own. Raised in a neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, Carlos had seen his fair share of hardship. His father had passed away when he was just a child, and his mother worked long hours at the local factory, leaving Carlos to roam the streets. He became adept at finding treasure in the most unlikely of places: abandoned homes, demolished buildings, and hidden corners of the city. His mother had often warned him about the dangers of his scavenger lifestyle, but he dismissed her concerns, finding solace in the small, shiny objects he brought home each evening. The day Carlos found the cobalt blue cylinder, he had no idea what he had stumbled upon. The object appeared to be an industrial part, old but valuable. So he tucked it into his bag and went home, eager to see if he could sell it to the local scrapyard. It wasn't until a few days later that he began to notice something strange. The cylinder, which had initially been cool to the touch, began to radiate heat. At first he thought it was the sun or the temperature in his small apartment. But when his skin began to burn at the touch of the metal, Carlos realized something was wrong. By that point, he had already spent a considerable amount of time near it, unaware of its dangers. His hands began to blister, and the warmth turned into an uncomfortable, almost painful heat that didn't fade. His vision blurred, but he didn't understand what was happening. The hospital staff couldn't comprehend the sheer scale of the situation at first. The first few cases seemed to be a fluke: strange rashes, dizziness, and nausea that had no clear explanation. But as the days went by, more and more people came into the hospital with identical symptoms. The staff had no idea that they were dealing with a radiation poisoning crisis. It wasn't until Dr. Souza, a physician specializing in infectious diseases, observed a pattern in the cases, that the truth began to emerge. There was one common link between all the victims. They had all come into contact with an object from the same source: Carlos's mysterious find. Dr. Souza, after much deliberation, asked the police to track down the object. The small hospital room where the victims were isolated became a breeding ground for panic. The nurses, many of whom had never encountered radiation sickness, were beginning to show symptoms themselves: headaches, fatigue, and extreme nausea. Dr. Souza was forced to make a decision. They needed to isolate the patients and ensure that the contagion didn't spread. But no one knew how to contain what was essentially an invisible killer. The aftermath of the accident was far-reaching. What began as a medical crisis turned into an environmental catastrophe. Radiation spread through the very streets of Goiânia. Toxic particles entered the soil, water, and the air. People who had never come into direct contact with the source of the contamination began to feel the effects of radiation exposure. The sense of community in the once vibrant city was shattered. For weeks, authorities were at a loss as to how to contain the contamination. Experts were flown in from across the globe, and teams of workers in protective suits began scouring the city for contaminated objects. But by then, it was too late. The damage had been done. Entire neighborhoods were evacuated, and a sense of doom settled over the city. The residents, once proud of their close-knit community, now faced an uncertain future as they lived in a place where the very air they breathed could be deadly. Carlos had no idea of the chaos his discovery would cause. By the time the authorities tracked him down, he was already experiencing the devastating effects of radiation poisoning. His body was deteriorating at an alarming rate, his once youthful skin now covered in grotesque, swollen sores. His story, once filled with adventure and dreams, became one of sorrow and regret. He was confined to a hospital room, just one of the many victims who had unknowingly set off a chain of events that would forever change the course of Goiânia's history. When asked how he felt about his role in the tragedy, Carlos could only muster a whisper: "I didn't know." The Goiânia radiation accident left behind a scar on both the land and the people. The tragedy highlighted the hidden dangers of the modern world, and the devastating effects of ignorance and negligence. Carlos's life, and the lives of countless others, would never be the same. The cleanup of Goiânia took years, and the wounds left by the incident remained long after the last of the radioactive debris had been removed. The Mexican Skinwalker. Daniel had been in many places that seemed out of time, but there was something uniquely unsettling about San Antonio de las Flores. The village, nestled deep in the heart of Mexico, was surrounded by an almost impenetrable wilderness. The dense trees of the forest seemed to close in around the small town like sentinels, whispering secrets only the wind understood. It was here that Daniel decided to set up his base for the photography project. The village had an air of mystery to it, a place where old traditions still thrived. The locals were deeply spiritual, practicing rituals passed down through generations. Despite their welcoming nature, they held a certain wariness in their eyes, as though they were guarding something ancient and hidden. It was a feeling that Daniel couldn't shake as he began to photograph the surrounding area. His interest peaked when he heard stories from the villagers about La Loba, a mythical figure who was said to haunt the surrounding woods. But it wasn't until the night of the full moon that Daniel came face to face with a nightmare that would forever alter his life. Daniel's interest in supernatural photography was a means of connecting to his past. Growing up in a family that dismissed legends as mere superstition, Daniel found solace in the tangible. Photographs, proof, something real he could hold in his hands. But his fascination with the unknown, the eerie tales of creatures that lurked in the dark, had always been with him. It was what led him to study folklore and anthropology in school, hoping to uncover the hidden truths behind legends. But when Marco, his closest friend and fellow photographer, urged him to explore San Antonio, Daniel had no idea that the journey would be much more than an academic pursuit. Marco was a skeptic, always ready to dismiss anything that couldn't be explained. But as they ventured deeper into the village and heard more stories from the locals, Daniel began to wonder if there was more truth to the myths than he had ever imagined. The night they encountered the Skinwalker, they had ventured deep into the forest, ignoring the warnings of the villagers. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the moon hung high above them, casting long, ghostly shadows on the ground. As they set up their cameras, a strange chill descended upon them. The rustling of leaves had initially seemed like a typical forest noise, but the sound grew louder, more deliberate. The footsteps that followed were not those of any animal Daniel knew. Marco, who had been joking about the local legends, fell silent as the sound of cracking branches grew nearer. "Did you hear that?" Marco whispered, his voice trembling. Before Daniel could respond, a figure emerged from the shadows, tall, gaunt, and moving with an unnatural grace. Its eyes gleamed, glowing like two fiery embers in the dark. And then, as it stepped closer, its form twisted, its face contorted into a grotesque mockery of humanity. The creature's laugh echoed through the trees, a guttural, mocking sound that froze their blood. It circled them, its distorted face shifting with each movement. Daniel felt as if the very air had thickened, choking him, suffocating him with fear. Marco tried to run, but the creature was too fast. With a movement so swift it seemed impossible, the Skinwalker lunged and knocked him to the ground. Daniel watched in horror as Marco's body twisted, his bones contorting and cracking like dry twigs underfoot. It wasn't Marco anymore. It couldn't be. The Skinwalker had taken him, transformed him into something inhuman. Daniel's only instinct was to flee, but his legs felt heavy, as if the ground itself was holding him in place. The creature's eyes bored into him, its gaze cold and merciless. And for a moment, Daniel was sure it would tear him apart as well. In the aftermath, Daniel was left alone in the forest. surrounded by the twisted remnants of the creature's transformation. Marco was gone, his body never found. The photographs Daniel had taken during the encounter were blurry, distorted, as if the very act of capturing the creature had warped the images themselves. The villagers refused to speak of what had happened that night, and Daniel returned to the city with a deep sense of dread lingering over him. But he could never shake the feeling that the skinwalker was still out there, somewhere, waiting for him. Haunting of the Bell Witch. The Bell family's arrival in Red River in the early 1800s was part of the wider migration of settlers heading west, seeking new land and opportunities. John Bell, a sturdy, hard-working farmer, had left his birthplace in North Carolina in search of a fresh start. Along with his wife, Lucy, and their children, he carved out a life for himself on a small plot of land along the Red River in what is now Adams, Tennessee. The area was wild, untamed, and filled with the promise of new beginnings. John Bell was a quiet, reserved man, known for his strong morals and gentle temperament. His wife, Lucy, was a warm-hearted woman with a reputation for her hospitality, welcoming everyone who came to their door with a smile. Their children were well loved by the community. They were lively, friendly, and full of energy. At first, everything seemed idyllic for the Bell family. Their cabin was small but cozy, nestled in a secluded valley surrounded by dense woods. The family had settled into the rhythms of rural life, tending to crops, raising livestock, and building friendships with their neighbors. It was the peaceful life they had hoped for. But as the days passed, a strange energy began to settle over the land. Some of the neighbors spoke in hushed tones of an old legend that had been passed down through the generations. The story of the Bell Witch, a vengeful spirit said to haunt the woods surrounding the river. The legend was more than just a tale. For those who lived in the area, it was a story steeped in mystery, a warning of something malevolent that resided deep within the forest. No one knew for sure who the Bell Witch was or what she wanted, but the name sent chills down the spine of every resident of Red River. The first strange occurrence took place late one evening in the spring of 1817. John Bell had just returned from a long day of work in the fields when he heard a peculiar sound coming from the direction of the cabin. At first he thought it was his children playing tricks on him, but as he approached, the sound grew louder, an eerie knocking, like someone was tapping on the door from the outside. Perplexed, John opened the door, only to find nothing but the empty expanse of the yard before him. He thought it odd, but shrugged it off, assuming it was some kind of animal or perhaps a trick of the wind. But as the days passed, the knocking continued, and it was no longer just a sound. The family began to experience other strange phenomena. At night, they heard what sounded like footsteps moving through the house, heavy, deliberate steps that seemed to echo in the darkness. Furniture would move on its own, and doors would creak open even though they had been securely shut. The most disturbing part was the constant whispering that seemed to emanate from nowhere, a low murmur that filled the air like the voice of someone just out of reach. The Bell family was terrified. At first, they kept their fears to themselves, afraid of being branded as superstitious fools. But as the strange occurrences grew more intense, they could no longer ignore the terror that had gripped their home. One night, as the family sat down to dinner, a loud, guttural voice filled the room. The voice was unnatural, both male and female at once, with an eerie cadence that seemed to rattle the very walls of the cabin. It called out to John Bell, asking him questions, mocking him, and even threatening him. "Why have you come here?" the voice asked, its tone dripping with malice. John was taken aback, but he tried to remain calm. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaking. The entity responded by repeating his name, John Bell. Terrified, John called for his wife Lucy and their children, but they had already heard the voice and were equally horrified. The room grew cold, the air thick with an invisible pressure. The family's dog began to bark wildly, but no one could see anything. The voice taunted them, its words becoming increasingly hostile. The Bell family, no strangers to hardship, realized that this was no ordinary haunting. This was something far more sinister. The voice, now identified as the Bell Witch, was not merely content to linger in the shadows. She began to actively torment them, following them wherever they went. As weeks turned into months, the Bell Witch's presence became more pronounced. The sounds of footsteps and knocking grew louder, and the voice began to escalate. She would call out to Lucy, accusing her of witchcraft and mock her for her kindness. It whispered in the children's ears at night, sending them into fits of terror. John Bell, a man of faith, sought help from the local preachers, hoping that their prayers and spiritual authority could drive the evil spirit away. But when the ministers arrived, the Bell Witch only laughed at them, taunting their feeble attempts to expel her. It became clear that no earthly force could banish the witch from their home.